Hi everyone, I'm sorry I'm not there to do this in person, but I hope you enjoy this TED Talk about composing stories and play. Oh no, we're gonna crash into that alien! Duck, duck! He shouted as we quickly dipped to the right. Whew, I sighed, we missed it. Let's hope we don't run into any other aliens on our way to the moon in this helicopter. This vignette and this photograph illustrate just one of the many instances in which my 3-year-old best friend Bennett and I collaboratively storied our way into play. The box that had delivered the wedding flowers for the side business his mother operated held for Bennett and I a wealth of possibilities. Earlier in the afternoon, this box had been our ship as we sought treasure and escaped the jaws of a massive shark, not to mention the other pirates we needed to battle despite our sunburns from the beach. Now, the same cardboard box construct, powered by jet fuel and held laser beams and lightsabers as it propelled us to the moon. Utilizing this experience as a springboard, the purpose of this paper and this conversation today is to demonstrate that there is a great necessity for exploring scholarship that emphasizes meaning-making of not only alphabetic print and/or written text, but also of the multiple modes of representation and the content of this kind of composing. Several questions guide me as I do this work to gather together important perspectives that consider what it means to extend the definition of literacies and composing to include the storying and play of young children. Undergirding this work is the following question: how could children's storying and play open a new avenue for participation in composing and literacies? The intention behind this paper is to bring multiple perspectives into conversation, to reimagine how storying and play could be representative of multimodal composing, and to inquire about what then could be learned from children's playing games. So about the box that we saw with Bennett. There's a small children's story called Not Just a Box, in which a rabbit, the one you see here, is challenged multiple times that this is just a box, but rather through imaginative play creates multiple stories, such as a burning building. Recent scholarship illuminates the ways in which this sort of play-based literacy creates social spaces rich with opportunities as showcased in the work of Karen Woland. Through this work with her early elementary students, she focused on play-based literacies and suggested that providing a contextualized learning experience extends children's engagement with new basics. Building upon this framework, this paper explores the ways in which children story through play. Further, this work considers how alternative modes of composing might expand access to literacies and composing within communities and schools, particularly those that are traditionally marked as marginalized. In an effort to investigate how acknowledging, affirming, and incorporating children's storying and play as a means to address the aforementioned questions, I begin with an introduction to the expansive notions of literacies. Over the last 20 years, scholarship has explored a plurality of literacies across disciplines. Academics have worked to demonstrate or deconstruct capital L literacy in an effort to conceive of a literacy in a more inclusive and hence expansive form, to allow for greater access into what counts as literacy. More specifically, the dismantling of literacy and its focus on foundational skills is considered by a number of theorists to include new literacy studies with Brian Street, social literacies with G, and multiliteracies with the New London Group. Each of these conceives of literacies and to provide for a more expansive understanding of what counts. In particular, I also want to consider Heath's work that illustrates the literacies present in students' homes, social networks, and families, and how such literacies might be leveraged to make school a more equitable space for all learners. Duke, Purcell, Gates, Hall, and Tower note how growth occurs in both reading and writing for students provided opportunities for engagement in authentic literacy activities, or those literacy events that replicate and or reflect real-world practices. Similarly, findings by Gambrell, Calvert, Malloy suggest that utilizing authentic literacy tasks not only supports but also sustains students' engagement in literacy learning. Authentic literacy activities are primarily focused on text type, either those read or written, and grounded in an authentic purpose. Texts are deemed authentic, as described by Duke and her colleagues, when they are useful outside of the scope of learning to read and or write. Yet I suggest that the definition and examples of authentic literacy provided by Duke and her peers largely confine literacy to alphabetic print. Although studies of authentic literacy often focus on written text, the multiplicity of ways in which people of all ages meaningfully engage with text in daily life is frequently overlooked within the classroom. Rather, school-based literacies provide a narrow scope of what types of literacies are valued. Though the concept of multimodal composition, then, has been taken up and theorized by researchers and practitioners within rhetoric and composition, the prevalence of this form of composition are still lacking. Thus, as self suggests, practitioners must provide a context not only for talking about different literacies, but also for practicing different literacies, learning to create texts that combine a range of modalities as communicative resources. Though these scholars speak to compositionists and rhetoricians at the post-secondary level, I propose that a similar reimagining that emphasizes composing as meaning-making beyond alphabetic print and/or written text is also necessary, particularly in elementary classrooms. Additionally, I argue that situating the student as a maker of knowledge, as Yancey does, will advance education's understanding of children's composing. Further still, I suggest that children's storying and play, when viewed as a composing practice, are natural tools that provide insights into children's thoughts. At this juncture, though, I offer both caution and clarification. My call for moving beyond a written alphabetic print and towards a more robust understanding of composing, including as meaning making, including this fort you see pictured here, is not simply focused on adaptation and integration of digital tools and text. Instead, like Shipka, I contend communication occurs in digital and non-digital, written and non-written ways. Thus, for the purposes of this conversation, I draw upon Shipka to define composing practices as communication that utilizes a variety of modes to include, but not limited to, visual, gestural, bodily movements, oral, and textural forms of representation as they intersect and interact to create meaning. Expanding the definition of composing and literacies in this way is important for learning as well as teaching because, as Besmer and Kress note, writing is now no longer the central mode of representation in learning materials. To disregard multiple forms, then, and modes of composing limits our understanding of the meaning-making abilities of other composing. This is not to say that teaching and learning within the English language arts classroom should abandon writing as a communicative tool. Rather, I propose that multiple modes of communication should be considered as possibilities wherein they account for many voices, even those new, marginalized, or unpopular voices, to be heard. By valuing multiple ways of knowing, creating, and participating in literacies and composing, while simultaneously acknowledging how composing is situated and shaped by context, history, audience, place, time, and other factors, composing can be used to question hegemonic ways of knowing and literacy practices. Hence, through this review, I contend that a broader definition of composing that considers various modes of design and representation along with content is essential for progressing towards more equitable education. Dyson notes how the evolving composing practices of children offer playful possibilities, specifically those generated by children during classroom writing. Dyson explores the relationship between children's work and play, made more complex by the rigorous regulatory structures of a typical writing period. Focused on how interactions with other students through unofficial practices can not only inform but also transform official composing opportunities, Dyson identifies such possibilities through the example of the Pinecone Wars, an imaginary recess game in which teams of first graders claim and defend their turf on the playground and write about it in the classroom. Dyson cites how curricular expectations permit very few modalities beyond alphabetic print, and how such narrow views fail to capture unofficial practices of literacy. As such, she argues that with continued standardization aimed at developing automatic skills, the gap between the official and unofficial worlds of children's writing and meaning-making will persist. Hence, Dyson calls for discussion about how the official world can take into account the playfulness and inventiveness of children's collaborative worlds. Dyson's earlier work investigated children's use of media and cultural symbols, for example superheroes, in composing practices, particularly how children utilize them to combat social and ideological structures. Through this ethnographic study, Dyson reveals how children's play represents complex construction of story while simultaneously offering both social critique and resistance. She notes how children positioning themselves in stories can not only reveal dominant ideological assumptions, but also illustrates how, through the use of popular media, children also negotiate social organization. Using an action and material-oriented view of literacy, Karen Wolin describes for readers how the construction of electric eels by kindergarten boys are one and the same of the construction and play of Star Wars lightsabers. Wolin takes up the construction of eels as an action text composed by the kindergarten boys to illuminate the embodied forms of literacy practice and play, and how these are invoked to maneuver and traverse across both school and peer cultures. The paper tubes that she writes about cannot simply be lightsabers because weaponry, real or imagined, is not a favorable or acceptable tool in schools. Hence, the paper tubes, marked by the lines of electricity, flexibly adapted to the circumstances of the situation. For example, only when the teacher turned her back to the boys composing did the rolled paper mediate play between Jedi Knights. As quickly as this play emerged, it regressed back into the more appropriate play of eels for the eyes of the official world and teacher. In concluding her piece, Wolin describes how the material and embodied forms of literacy and play are nested within a myriad of school, peer, and larger youth and childhood communities and cultures. Situated within the multiliteracies framework, Wolin's depiction of child's play as composing aligns well with New London's group's theory insofar as it accounts for the socially situated nature of writing and to include the visual, linguistic, audio, gestural, spatial, and multimodal patterns of composing. Ultimately, through her piece, she sheds light on the unspoken, unwritten literacies that occur naturally across children's play. Children's stories also served as the focal point in emerging scholar Flynn's dissertation. In this study, Flynn explored the most basic parts of children's language as they negotiated identity and classroom culture to create meaning across 4 Head Start centers. In particular, the story circles that were used as a tool to promote children's talk and allow space for children to story within the classroom. Story circles, as she notes, facilitate opportunities structured in a way that allows individual children to actively partake in storying by telling a story of their choosing. The evidence presented within the dissertation illuminates the affordances of this strategy in the development of children's language and literacy practices as they negotiate story. Husby's data also presents interesting insights into how elementary children navigate and negotiate social relationships to collaboratively story as they co-create a movie. In the pilot of his project, Husby describes how children in the mixed-age enrichment classroom bargained with one another, not just in the writing of their script, but also in identifying what roles each person would play. Husby notes how persistence from each child to have his or her idea prominently featured in the script led to the work stalling out after only 2 days. Eventually, he and 3 students collaborated to write the narrative that would be performed. In an effort to ensure the work was child-centered, each individual felt they were represented in the final script. Husby and his co-writers did a member check with the other 6 participants. Once a script was approved and agreed upon by the children, they collectively casted one another in the roles for the film. Casting, like the writing of the script, required children to actively persuade peers to take on particular social roles. For example, Husby explains how one third-grade participant, despite her insistence to work only in the background, her peers eventually, within the class, eventually convinced her to take on the role in the film. Based upon her own experiences across 4 Head Start classrooms, Flynn called for a reimagining of the way literacy learning happened in the classroom. She argued that practices currently in place offer far too shallow of a conception of teaching literacy and language, especially given the capability of young children to story as they did within her study and prove capable of doing. Thus, she calls for an opening of spaces to do as self-proclaimed earlier, to not only talk about these different literacies and composing practices, but actually to practice them. Expanding the way literacies are not just theorized as well as composing, but also how they are practiced will, as argued by the scholars within this review, build upon children's lived experiences to extend their understanding and utilization of language and literacy in composing practices. The classrooms and school settings these researchers observed provided many different perspectives as to how this might be done while still offering a rigorous but safe learning environment. Much like the children featured in the work of both Dyson and Woland, Flynn's participants generated stories that drew upon their lived experiences as well as their favorite characters from popular media. Often, characters from popular media allowed students to practice more sophisticated forms of composing. This is perhaps best exemplified in Woland's example of the unspoken story between the kindergarten Jedi Knights. Thus, they similarly propose a rethinking of school-sanctioned literacies so that they might include superheroes and princesses within the classroom. Findings from these studies demonstrate how children represent literacies not as a collection of technical skills, but rather as cultural practice to bring about meaningful and purposeful resistance to disrupt hegemonic structures of power within society. These studies also promote the inclusion of children's home language and literacy practices as means to engage them as they navigate and negotiate socially constructed identities. Across the work of these scholars, it is apparent that the act of composing specifically is related to storying and play is not monolithic. As Shipka explains, expanding notions of literacy to include composing empowers individuals to choose wisely, critically, and purposefully the relationship structures and representation systems that are most fitting or appropriate given the purpose, potentials, and context of one's work. Additionally, the findings included in this review demonstrate how children draw upon and represent various forms of funds of knowledge in their composing practices. In a similar way to what has already been stated, I contend that these investigations have both theoretical and practical significance and can extend access of literacies to all students insofar as their findings encourage inclusivity and explore the mutually sustaining relationships of multiple ways of knowing. An underlying theme prevalent across the studies included within this conversation was the persistent notion that within many classrooms, schools, and broader sects of society, children's ability to act as full participants in literacy is underestimated. Though this belief pervades much of the work that is done with and alongside children by both practitioners and researchers, few researchers, like those mentioned here, suggest otherwise. As Flynn writes, children who are traditionally marginalized by the wider society are in fact quite active learners who seek and notice new things. Hence, to consider children too young, too mature, or too inexperienced to participate in sophisticated acts of composing overlooks the numerous ways children story across play and their daily